whereby the lone inventor, the creative genius, has some kind of funding set up for his experiments and his tinkering. And we should have other people who take them, things that he finds out, and go into development with it. Because development is a separate problem. And then take care of the inventor. If you did that, a lot of the things that we think are barriers would change very quickly. Well, they buried Tesla very early on for the very idea that he was going to give the world real cheap energy. And that was the last thing they wanted to do.
Well, we can thank J.P. Morgan for that. I don't mind pointing a figure at him. History is quite adamant in its condemnation of J.P. Morgan and what he did to Nikola Tesla. He denied us free energy.
But he also gave you the Spanish-American War. He engineered that little fiasco.
I think that it wouldn't take too much to say that he gave us World War I.
A great deal of it, that's right.
And he gave us great economic disasters because of greed. And I'm looking at a young man whose life has been threatened because he wants to give you free energy right now, and that's John Bedini. And those things, of course, make me extremely angry. What we want to do, Tom, we're going to have to take a break here right now. Take a little pause for the news. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Hour 2 of Open Mind tonight. I'm Bill Jenkins. It's KABC. And we're talking about your future. A whole new, bright and brilliant future if it's allowed to develop and flourish. And I think it can. And with me in the studio are two of the men that are terribly responsible for it, Mr. John C. Bedini and Mr. Stephen Worth. And on the telephone, speaking to us from Dallas, Texas, is Thomas E. Bearden. Tom has electrified, if I can use that term, this audience for many, many years. And as we talked, John Bedini came into being. Tom, you remember that?
Yeah, I sure do. I certainly do.
John is amongst us. He has done some things. We're looking at things in this studio right now that would that most people that are in electronics would say are impossible, that they cannot happen. Certainly, he has just fractured the second law of thermodynamics and the law of conservation of energy with not only these two devices, but the other ones that are over there. We call it his laboratory. Well, you've seen it and I've seen it. It's too bad he doesn't have a real laboratory to work in. But the science is here, that we can tap this river of energy that you talk about, and it can be put to work, and it can be put to work in our homes, and it can be put to work in our industries, it can be put to work everywhere on the world. We don't have to burn oil anymore. We don't have to build great dams anymore. We don't have to expend vast amounts of our wealth for energy. Most people don't seem to realize that their energy cost is the greatest single cost they have. Every bite of food that they eat, they pay an energy cost for. Every stitch of clothing they wear, they pay an energy cost for. Every good and service that they consume, they pay an energy cost for. Whenever you start adding all of that up on top of your electric bill and your gasoline bill, those obvious energy costs, it turns out to be a greater cost than taxes, if you can imagine that. I shouldn't say that because that'll give the IRS an idea to run forward and try to get more money than your energy costs are. Hello?
Hello. I'm still here. I was thinking about the things you were saying, and I guess one of the things that I did want to point out was that every time in science that there's been a fundamental change that occurred, there has been extreme resistance to that change. We long since have forgotten it, of course, but when Einstein brought out relativity, it was caused a furor. The conventional physicists at one time, were prone to make statements like, there's only a dozen people in the world can understand it. Many physicists never accepted it to their dying day. But the young graduate students who had not yet been brainwashed didn't have that big a problem in understanding it. So when more and more of those young graduate students came out, all of a sudden relativity was an accepted term, an applied term. The thing has happened with many other things. Ironically, the fellow who really discovered conservation of energy, or mostly Meyer, was hounded literally by the scientists of his day into the insane asylum. Finally got out of there, treatment and so forth. But in his later life, he was then eulogized as a great man when he'd been called an utter fool. The great Gauss, for example, worked out nonlinear geometry and didn't dare publish it for over 30 years. He wouldn't publish it because he knew it would destroy him if he did, that his fellow scientists would destroy him.
But now they revere him.
Being a brash young man, published it, and they destroyed him. So science has a record. Anybody who knows anything at all about the history of science, it has a record, its own record right now, with opposing bitterly every fundamental new change that's come out.
Well, I think most everybody is familiar with the story of Madame Curie.
Certainly. The lady here recently, suddenly her name escapes me, that, with the corn, with genes and so forth that could change. That was utter nonsense. And then all of a sudden she winds up getting a Nobel Prize some decades later. But every single thing that's been a drastic change has been done that way and been opposed in that fashion. The great Planck himself, Max Planck, once said that, the only way you get a new physics is when the old physicists die off that so bitterly oppose it and stop it. And I think the real thing that the experimenters like John Bedini and so forth have done is to point a very strong finger at unique effects and results that are to be gained by making deliberately electromagnetic stressed zeros. And I think the thing to do is to say, look, these kinds of effects have not been investigated by the universities. Don't you think it's about time that the universities themselves started doing the investigation? I've reached this point. If someone calls me and starts objecting to these kinds of ideas on principles in the present textbook, my first question to them is this: have you ever done a set of experiments in this area where you made such stressed electromagnetic zeros and examined the behavior of materials and circuits and so forth with those electromagnetic entities? If the answer to that is no, I have not done such experiments and made such a great investigation, then my next response to them is, don't bother me until you have. You don't know what you're talking about. Because what happens is that people like John Bedini are doing that. And a whole host of other young fellows right now who are beginning to do these kinds of experiments. And the thing we really are trying to do, and John is trying to do, is to try to point out to these young fellows, don't believe these self-imposed limitations and assumptions. You can change those assumptions. And in this area, if your textbook doesn't tell you what happens when you make this kind of thing, go do your own experiments and find out. Do it by the scientific method. Don't believe dogma.
These laws were not fingered by God on tablets of stone on Mount Sinai.
That's correct. If as long as you do not change the assumptions on which those laws are based, you're going to get those laws. They are very good laws, very good descriptions. So if you change some of the fundamental assumptions, and here we're changing one of them, because all of those conservation laws assume you do not have stress zeros like that, where energy is locked into vacuum and deliberately varied by patterns, deterministic patterns. If you have not investigated those kinds of experiments, you have nothing scientifically to reject it out of hand with. So at least reserve the judgment until you've done experiments. With that, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the new energy developments that John and Steve have done.
Well, I appreciate your comments there, Tom. I just wanted to add one thing. A friend of yours and mine was a guest on this, Dr. Ruggiero Santelli. And he pointed out a very, very important fact, I think, concerning the universities when they get into this kind of experimentation. And certainly we have great citadels of learning here in Southern California, and a lot of those people listen to this radio program. And we have great aerospace industries that are deeply involved in science. But if they were to start getting into these experiments, they have all at once rendered their textbooks useless. They have kissed off great grants, goodbye, and contracts, goodbye, based upon an old science. And they do not want to upset the economic apple cart or their egomanic apple cart, because they are now